Imagine Rome in the 1st century, before the sun has risen fully over its red-tiled rooftops. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wet stone, ashes from last night's hearths, and the faint, comforting smoke from morning fires, now being lit in bakeries along narrow streets. The Tiber moves slowly, its brown waters gliding past ancient bridges, carrying the reflections of dawn's pale light. Vendors begin to arrange their wares quietly. Baskets of figs, olives, and coarse bread stacked carefully as sleepy-eyed passers-by shuffle to temples or public baths. The soft clinking of coins, a quiet promise of the day's business. Rome, even at dawn, hums with life, though it is a slow hum, steady and calm. In these first hours, at the heart of this vast city sits the Palatine Hill, where the emperor's palace rises above the streets. Inside its marble halls, with mosaics of dolphins and vines winding underfoot, servants move like whispers, preparing the chambers and courtyards for another day under the rule of Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, whom history knows more familiarly as Caligula. Caligula, whose childhood nickname meant Little Boots, due to the small military sandals he wore as a child on campaign with his father Germanicus, came to power in 37 AD, a young man not yet 25, carrying the immense weight of Rome's expectations. At first, many believed Caligula would be a kind, joyful ruler, a bright flame after the brooding reign of Tiberius. The Senate, weary from years of fear, cheered his arrival. The people of Rome rejoiced, filling the streets with flowers, lighting lamps at night in celebration, hoping for a new era of peace and generosity. For a time, it seemed their hopes might be fulfilled. Caligula distributed money to the people, staged lavish games in the Circus Maximus, and opened public banquets that allowed even the poorest citizens to taste the rich foods of the empire. Roasted meats, honeyed pastries, wine from distant provinces, figs so sweet they seemed to melt on the tongue. But Rome was never a place where peace came easily, and the purple robes of the emperor carried invisible burdens. The Senate, while appearing respectful, whispered in quiet corners, their loyalty shifting like shadows. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's protectors, watched everything with cold, assessing eyes. Plots were common, suspicions endless, and the empire was large enough that each province carried its own tension, ready to erupt. Amid these pressures, Caligula changed. Ancient sources suggest he fell ill within the first year of his reign, struck by a fever that left him bedridden for weeks. When he recovered, it was as if a subtle but sharp wind had swept through his mind, leaving the corners of it unsettled. He was no longer the laughing young man the people had cheered for, but a ruler who grew suspicious, restless, and strangely obsessed with power's boundaries. Caligula's life was ruled by excess, but also by fear. Fear of losing power, fear of betrayal, fear of the silence that came in the quiet hours of the night. The emperor began to demand more of those around him, summoning senators and court members at all hours to his chambers, forcing them to remain awake long into the night as he paced, spoke, or simply sat in restless silence. He held meetings by torchlight, his face pale and shadowed, the flickering light playing on the gold and marble of his chambers, while senators, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, struggled to remain upright, nodding whenever Caligula paused, as if he expected agreement. The emperor's nights stretched on, hour after hour, with musicians summoned to play softly in the background while he dined alone, or with chosen guests forced to sit near him, swallowing yawns as they tried to keep up with his scattered conversations. Some whispered that Caligula was afraid of sleep, fearing that in sleep he was vulnerable, that the world might shift without him noticing, that plots would bloom in the darkness of the night while he lay defenseless. In these months, the court of Caligula became a place of quiet misery for those who served him. Slaves and freedmen were required to be on hand at all hours, bringing food, wine, or messages to the emperor, who would change his mind in a moment, demanding one thing and then another. Senators were forced to wait in outer chambers, their togas wrinkled, their heads nodding forward as sleep tried to claim them. Some would slip into brief moments of slumber, only to be jolted awake by the sound of footsteps or the soft call of a servant announcing that Caligula required their presence. In the candlelit halls, men with dry, reddened eyes waited, whispering quietly about how many hours they had been awake, how long it had been since they last saw their homes, how desperately they wished for the comfort of their beds. It is said that Caligula, in his moments of restless pacing, spoke of sleep with disdain. "Sleep is a thief," he may have said, "stealing hours from my reign." Whether or not these were his exact words, the emperor's actions made it clear that he saw sleep not as a necessity, but as a weakness, a vulnerability that he and those around him should learn to overcome. And so the emperor waged a quiet war on sleep, forcing his court into long vigils, demanding their presence at his side during the darkest hours, as if he believed that to be awake was to be alive, and to sleep was to surrender power, if only for a moment. In the quiet hours before dawn, Rome would sometimes seem eerily alive in the palace, with the sounds of footsteps in corridors, the low murmur of exhausted voices, and the soft notes of a lyre being played by a musician too tired to hold the tune steady. Outside the palace, Rome slept. Bakers prepared the first loaves of the day. Guards dozed lightly at their posts. Mothers soothed restless children back to sleep. The city was at rest, wrapped in the darkness of night, while within the palace, the emperor's vigil continued. And so, night after night, Caligula stood awake, looking out over the torchlit courtyards of his palace, convinced that he was conquering the darkness simply by refusing to close his eyes, by forcing his court to share in his sleepless rule. As you let your breath slow now, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, consider, what drives a man to fear the quiet embrace of sleep? Was Caligula's refusal to rest a sign of power, or the quiet unraveling of a mind burdened by fear? In the deep hush of Rome's palace corridors, the air was thick with the scent of warm oil lamps, beeswax candles, and the faint tang of wine spilled on marble floors. These late hours, meant for sleep and dreams, became hours of anxious wakefulness for those who served Caligula. The emperor's quiet war on sleep was no formal decree. There was no scroll nailed to a forum pillar declaring that Romans must stay awake. Yet, within the court, it was as if the very concept of sleep had become an unspoken crime. The emperor's guards no longer stood shifts divided by the moon's rise and set. Instead, they stood endlessly, fingers tapping spear shafts, eyes drooping before snapping open with guilt. Slaves paced softly, ready to fetch fruit, wine, or more candles, glancing often toward the shadowed corners, where it was rumored Caligula himself might appear without warning, testing their vigilance. Caligula's nights often began with feasts held well past the hour when Rome's street torches were snuffed out. The emperor, restless, would summon senators and their wives to recline on couches while musicians strummed weary tunes, the notes echoing off mosaic walls depicting dolphins and sea nymphs dancing beneath foaming waves. Servants brought platters of roasted game, olives slick with oil, and small, honey-soaked pastries meant to keep the guests awake. The emperor, sometimes in good humor, would laugh softly at a senator's half-hidden yawn, leaning forward to tease them with gentle words that held an edge sharper than any blade. Other times, he would fall silent, staring into the dark beyond the torchlight, lost in thoughts that chilled the air around him. For the guests, each hour felt like a test. A single nod of the head, a slip of the eyelids closing, might draw Caligula's attention. Some said he counted the yawns, remembering who was weak, who was strong, who was loyal enough to sit upright through the hours when the moon passed overhead, when the sky turned indigo, then gray. As the weeks turned into months, the effects of this sleepless regime were clear. Eyes became bloodshot, voices roughened into whispers, and minds, starved of dreams, began to wander. Senators misheard commands, answered questions with confusion, and made mistakes in calculations that once came easily. Servants dropped amphorae of wine or stumbled on steps they had walked 1,000 times in daylight. Some began to mutter prayers to Somnus, the Roman god of sleep, begging quietly for a moment's rest without fear of the emperor's notice. Others tried to steal moments of sleep standing upright, leaning against pillars, eyes open but unfocused, minds adrift. It was said that the emperor himself remained unchanged, his energy unbroken, his eyes clear and cold in the lamplight, as he paced, spoke, and demanded the company of those who could no longer keep up with his relentless need for wakefulness. Why did Caligula fear sleep so much? Ancient historians, writing decades after his death, speculated that he was haunted by dreams, that in sleep he saw the faces of those who hated him, or the shadows of the many who had died to secure his place. Others suggested that he believed sleep was a crack in the armor of power, a moment when the mind lost control, drifting into realms where even emperors were powerless. Perhaps, in the darkness of night, with the wind rattling shutters and the distant howls of dogs echoing across Rome's rooftops, Caligula felt that the world itself might turn against him if he closed his eyes. To remain awake was, in his mind, to remain in command of Rome's destiny, to hold the empire's fragile stability in hands that never unclenched. As the nights wore on, Rome's palace halls became echo chambers of whispers, half-finished sentences, and the soft creak of sandals on marble. Senators began to fear being called to the emperor's chambers, not only because of his mercurial moods, but because of the relentless exhaustion that came from never resting. Families of those who served in the palace noticed the toll. Fathers returned home at dawn, faces pale, hands trembling as they tried to sip watered wine before collapsing into short, dreamless sleeps that ended with the knock of a messenger calling them back to the palace. Some senators began to wonder if this was Caligula's intention all along, to weaken them, to make them pliable, to watch as their dignity eroded under the simple weight of human need for sleep. Outside the palace, Rome continued its rhythms, the poor and wealthy alike, sleeping under tiled roofs, their dreams carrying them away from the city's noise. Bakers kneaded dough before dawn, the smell of rising loaves spreading through alleys, while mothers soothed children back to sleep with songs older than the empire itself. The city was alive with its ordinary struggles, unaware that within the emperor's halls, men and women were becoming husks of themselves, haunted by the flickering shadows of lamps, drained by the emperor's demand that the night be treated as day. By denying sleep, Caligula denied the natural rhythms that had governed human life since time began. In doing so, he began to unravel the subtle fabric of his court's loyalty and stability. It was in these endless nights that the seeds of fear grew deeper, the emperor's paranoia matched only by the quiet desperation of those forced to match his wakefulness. Murmurs of dissatisfaction grew among the guards, who saw their officers nodding off during watches. Freedmen and slaves whispered about strange omens, about the thinness of the veil between waking and dreaming in those who had not truly slept in days. And so, the emperor's quiet war on sleep continued, a war fought not with swords, but with candlelight and the long, slow hours of night. As you drift now, breathing softly, ask yourself, how long can a leader deny sleep before the very fabric of power begins to tear? Can an empire survive under the rule of a man who feared dreams more than any enemy? As the months of forced wakefulness crawled forward, the quiet dread within Caligula's court became a weight pressing on every breath. Rome was a city built on endurance, of soldiers on the frontier, of farmers in dry fields, of merchants counting coins under flickering lamps. But even Rome's iron spirit was not designed to withstand the endless erosion of sleep. The senators who had once bowed with forced smiles now moved like ghosts through the marbled halls, eyes red and unfocused, minds fogged by exhaustion. Commanders of the Praetorian Guard, meant to be ever-vigilant protectors of the emperor, found their reflexes dulled, heads nodding during night watches, their hands trembling on sword hilts. The emperor's constant demands for their presence in the late hours, his restless pacing, his sudden laughter, his long silences, became unbearable. The candlelit vigils, once endured in hope of favor, turned into quiet moments of shared despair, as even Rome's elite learned what it meant to live in fear of sleep. In his quest to remain awake, Caligula found himself increasingly alone, even within a crowded room. Those summoned to his chambers came not with smiles, but with downcast eyes, hoping to avoid his notice. Laughter at his jokes became thin, strained, like the flickering of a candle about to die. He began to suspect those around him of betrayal, seeing in every yawn a sign of disloyalty, in every sleepy glance a conspiracy. Ancient historians claim he tested the limits of power by commanding senators to run beside his chariot, by forcing the wealthy to give up fortunes, and by demanding temples be built to honor him as a living god. Whether all these stories are true or embroidered by those who wrote of him later, one truth remains clear. Caligula's rule became a reign of fear, and fear does not thrive without rest. In the final weeks of Caligula's life, Rome was gripped by an uneasy silence. Markets still opened at dawn, bakeries still filled the air with warm bread, but whispers of the emperor's madness moved through the city like a soft breeze before a storm. In the palace, the emperor's wakeful nights continued. Senators were summoned in the dead of night for trivial matters, to hear him recite poetry, to watch him dance, to witness him sitting in silence as if he were testing who could remain awake longest. Those who fell asleep were fined or humiliated, their power slowly eroding under the weight of exhaustion. Guards began to share quiet looks, their hands tightening on spears as they watched Caligula's nightly processions through the halls. Accompanied by musicians, too tired to hold notes steady. By servants stumbling under trays of food no one wanted. And in these final nights, a plan began to take shape. It was said that Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, felt the weight of the emperor's cruelty and the exhaustion of sleepless nights more than most. Caligula, in his arrogance, had mocked Chaerea repeatedly, taunting him with crude jokes, forcing him to perform humiliating tasks during court gatherings held at impossible hours. The sleeplessness became a symbol of everything that was wrong under Caligula's rule. The emperor's whims controlling the lives of men who had once held honor, turning senators into puppets and guards into shadows of themselves. And so, under the dim glow of lamps, among men who had not truly rested in months, the conspiracy to end Caligula's reign found fertile ground. On January 24th, 41 AD, Caligula attended games held in the Palatine Games Theater, a short walk from his palace. The emperor, restless as always, moved through the corridors behind the stage, surrounded by guards and a handful of attendants. It was there, in the cramped passageways, that the conspirators struck. Ancient accounts differ on the exact details, but they agree on the quiet terror of that moment. Blades flashing in torchlight. The emperor's voice raised in confusion, then in pain, as he fell beneath the blows of those he had kept from sleep. The sounds of the assassination echoed softly in the passage, like the closing of a door that had been left open too long. Outside, Rome's streets remained calm, unaware that the sleepless emperor was gone. When word spread that Caligula was dead, there was fear, uncertainty, and, for many, a soft, almost guilty relief. In the palace, servants paused, looking toward the windows where daylight was rising, realizing for the first time in many months that there would be no summons in the dark, no restless emperor pacing halls, demanding their presence through the long hours of night. For the senators, there was cautious hope that Rome might return to its natural rhythms, that the endless vigils would end, that sleep could once again be something to embrace, not fear. And for the Praetorian Guard, there was the quiet knowledge that their oath had changed. They had ended a reign not through grand battle, but in the soft shadows of a passageway, with the quiet precision of men who had grown tired enough to act. Sleep returned to Rome quietly, like dawn spreading across the Tiber's surface. Merchants opened stalls at sunrise, not before, knowing they would not be summoned unexpectedly. Senators found they could sleep through the night, waking to clear thoughts and the comfort of morning air. Even in the palace, where the echoes of Caligula's restless footsteps still seemed to linger, the lamps were allowed to burn out, the candles left to gutter naturally as the dawn's light replaced them. Slaves who had lived in fear of being called in the dark hours now found they could close their eyes, resting without fear of the emperor's demands. Rome continued, as it always did, but the quiet, terrible reign of sleeplessness had ended. Caligula's reign was short, only 4 years, but the memory of his restless rule, his fear of sleep, and his demand that others share in his wakefulness left a mark on the Roman memory. Later emperors, learning from his failures, understood that power needed to be tempered by stability, that the natural rhythms of day and night could not be ignored without consequence. Historians would debate the causes of Caligula's behavior. Was it illness, madness, fear, or simply the corruption of absolute power? Whatever the reason, his war on sleep serves as a quiet lesson that even emperors cannot outrun the simple truths of being human. Sleep, for all people, remains a sanctuary, a place where the mind repairs, where fears can soften, and where the harshness of daylight can be set aside, if only for a few hours. As you lie quietly now, letting your breath slow, consider, what does it mean to be so afraid of dreams that you deny yourself the healing rest of sleep? Can any amount of power replace the gentle necessity of simply closing your eyes, breathing softly, and allowing yourself to drift away, trusting that the world will continue turning while you rest? Caligula could not conquer sleep, and in the end, it was his fear of it that led to the collapse of everything he tried to control. Let the soft hush of this ancient story remind you that it is safe to rest, that sleep is not weakness, but strength, and that even in the busiest of worlds, rest is a quiet victory.